Jane adjusted her blouse, fingers trembling slightly as she typed out a quick message to her husband. "Working late tonight, don't wait up." She hesitated for a moment, her thumb hovering over the send button. The lie sat heavy in her chest, but she pushed the thought aside and pressed send. The usual reply came within seconds. "Okay, love you." Love. The word looked foreign on her screen. She used to feel it, deep in her bones, but now it felt more like an obligation, a routine response that neither of them questioned. Jane tossed her phone onto the couch, sighing. The silence in the house was suffocating. The steady hum of the refrigerator in the background was the only sound filling the emptiness. She glanced at the laptop on the dining table, the Wi-Fi icon flashing in frustration. The internet had been cutting out all evening, as unreliable as the connection she once had with Michael. Annoyed, she grabbed her phone again, this time dialing the customer service number. "Thank you for calling. How can I assist you today?" "My Wi-Fi keeps disconnecting, and I need it fixed as soon as possible. I work from home, and this is disrupting everything," Jane said, trying to keep her irritation in check. "We'll send a technician first thing in the morning," the voice on the other end assured her. Jane sighed, rubbing her temple. "Fine." The next morning, the knock on the door came promptly at 8 a.m. Jane, still dressed in her silk robe, barely awake from a restless night, tightened the belt around her waist before opening the door. "Morning, ma'am. I'm Alex, here to check your internet issues." The man standing in front of her was not what she expected. He was younger than most technicians she had dealt with before, with sharp blue eyes, a confident smirk, and an ease about him that made her instantly aware of herself, of the way her robe clung to her form, of the faint scent of coffee and perfume still lingering on her skin. "Oh, right. Come in." Alex stepped inside, his eyes scanning the space as he set his tool bag down by the router. "So, what kind of trouble are we dealing with?" Jane crossed her arms, shifting slightly. "It keeps disconnecting, especially when I'm in the middle of work. It's frustrating." Alex nodded, crouching down beside the router. "I see this all the time. Could be interference, or maybe the network settings need an update." His voice was smooth, casual, as if they had known each other longer than just a few seconds. Jane found herself studying him, his strong hands as they worked the cables, the way his shirt stretched slightly over his toned arms. He glanced up suddenly, catching her gaze. For a second, neither spoke. Then Alex smirked. "I'll get this sorted out for you. Don't worry." Jane swallowed, forcing a smile. "Thanks." But deep down, she knew this was the beginning of something far more dangerous than just fixing a bad connection. As Alex tightened a cable near the router, Jane leaned in slightly, trying to see what he was doing. Her knee accidentally brushed against his arm, and he glanced up at her with a small smirk. "Sorry," she murmured, stepping back quickly, though the warmth of the brief touch lingered. "No problem," Alex said, adjusting the settings on his laptop. "At least you didn't spill coffee on me. You'd be surprised how often that happens when people panic about their Wi-Fi." Jane chuckled, crossing her arms. "I can imagine people probably lose their minds over the smallest glitches." Alex grinned. "Yeah, you wouldn't believe it. I had this one guy yell at me because his smart fridge wasn't connecting to his phone. Thought the world was ending." Jane laughed, genuinely amused. "God forbid he has to open the fridge the old-fashioned way." "Exactly." Alex shot her a playful look, his smile easy and relaxed. The light-hearted exchange caught Jane off guard. It had been a long time since she had felt this comfortable talking to someone, let alone a stranger. Her husband, Michael, had stopped joking with her like this years ago. Conversations at home were mostly about bills, schedules, and whether they had remembered to feed the dog. She found herself watching Alex as he worked, his hands moving with confidence, his sharp blue eyes focused on the screen. There was something effortless about him, something that made the room feel a little warmer. "You're good at this," she said, surprised at how natural the compliment felt. Alex looked up and flashed a grin. "I like fixing things. Keeps me busy." "Must be nice to always know what's wrong and how to fix it." Jane mused, tilting her head slightly. I wish relationships worked the same way. Alex's smirk faded slightly, replaced by something more thoughtful. Yeah, would be nice if you could just unplug things and start fresh when they stop working. Something about the way he said it made Jane pause. There was a weight behind his words, an unspoken story. She walked to the kitchen and opened the fridge. Do you want something to drink, coffee, water, or maybe something stronger? Alex glanced at the clock on his laptop. It's barely noon. Jane smirked, pulling out a cold bottle of beer and holding it up. I won't tell if you won't. Alex hesitated for a moment before standing up and stretching. Well, if the boss insists. They moved to the kitchen, the distance between them shrinking with each passing second. Jane handed him a bottle and opened one for herself, leaning against the counter as he took a sip. So what's your story? She asked, twirling the bottle in her hands. You talk like someone who's seen his fair share of things. Alex exhaled. Just got out of a long relationship. Thought it was solid. Turned out I was wrong. Jane raised an eyebrow. She left? He shook his head. Not exactly. I left when I realized she wasn't really there anymore. Jane swallowed, feeling a pang in her chest. I know the feeling. The air between them changed, the casual teasing giving way to something deeper, something unsaid. Alex held her gaze for a moment before looking away. I should probably finish up. Yeah, Jane said softly, though she didn't move. It was harmless, just a conversation, just a drink. But deep down she knew the spark had already been lit. As Alex set his empty bottle on the counter, Jane's fingers tightened around hers, her pulse quickening. The space between them felt unbearably small, the air charged with something neither of them had acknowledged aloud. Alex exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I should probably get going, he said, but he didn't move. Jane's heart pounded. The right choice was simple. Thank him, open the door, and let him leave. But the right choice felt impossible. She stepped forward, just enough to test the waters, just enough to feel the warmth of his presence against her. You sure? Her voice came out softer than she expected, almost a whisper. Alex's eyes flicked to hers, searching, hesitating. His jaw tightened as if he were battling some internal war. Then, his gaze dropped. Her lips, the slight rise and fall of her breath, the way her fingers toyed with the neck of the bottle. She didn't give herself time to overthink it. Before she could talk herself out of it, Jane closed the remaining distance between them, her lips pressing against his in a slow, uncertain kiss. For a moment, Alex froze. Then, like a dam breaking, he pulled her closer, his hands gripping her waist, his body pressing against hers as the kiss deepened. Jane gasped into his mouth, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body coming alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. There was no hesitation anymore, no space for doubt. The desire between them ignited, raw and consuming. Alex lifted her effortlessly, setting her on the kitchen counter. His hands roamed, exploring, tracing lines along her hips. Jane arched into him, her breath ragged, her fingers slipping beneath the hem of his shirt, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her palms. A distant voice in her mind screamed for her to stop, her husband, her marriage, the years she had built with Michael. But the voice was drowned out by the thrill racing through her veins, by the way Alex's lips trailed along her jaw, by the way his hands held her like he had been starving for this moment just as much as she had. They moved, stumbling toward the couch, never breaking contact, hands desperate to memorize each other. Jane's back met the cushions, her body melting into his as the last pieces of restraint shattered. No words were spoken. There was no talk of what this meant, no discussion of where the lines had blurred. Right now, there was only this moment, and neither of them wanted it to end. Jane lay still, staring at the ceiling, her breath still uneven. The weight of what had just happened pressed against her chest, yet she couldn't bring herself to regret it. The warmth of Alex's touch lingered on her skin, a reminder of how easily she had crossed a line she never thought she would. Alex sat at the edge of the couch, running a hand through his hair. He didn't say much at first, and Jane wasn't sure if she wanted him to. Words would make it real. Words would force them to acknowledge what they had done. Finally, he exhaled. "Jane." She shook her head, already knowing what he was going to say. "I don't want to talk about it." A beat of silence passed between them before he nodded. He got dressed quickly, slipping his shirt over his head as he walked toward the door. Jane followed, wrapping her robe around herself. She hesitated, watching his fingers hover over the doorknob. "This doesn't have to be a mistake," Alex murmured, his voice low. Jane's stomach tightened. She wanted to believe that, but the reality of her life, the husband waiting for her, the home she had built, the life she had promised, clawed at her conscience. "It already is," she whispered. Alex didn't argue. He simply nodded, casting one last glance at her before stepping out into the night. As soon as the door closed behind him, Jane exhaled shakily. She had no idea how to feel. The rush of excitement still coursed through her veins, but beneath it, guilt was creeping in like an unwelcome guest. She pressed a hand to her forehead, knowing she had two choices: bury this night in the deepest part of her memory or accept that she had started something she might not be able to stop. The next day, she expected regret to hit her full force, but instead she found herself replaying every moment in her mind. The way Alex had looked at her, the way he had touched her, the way he had made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. The thought should have scared her. Instead, it thrilled her. She told herself it was a one-time thing, a lapse in judgment. But when her phone buzzed that afternoon, and she saw Alex's name appear on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. Alex. "I haven't stopped thinking about last night." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She should ignore it. She should shut this down before it spiraled further out of control. Instead, she typed, "Jane, me neither." And just like that, it began. Days passed, then weeks. Jane found herself making excuses, more fake internet issues, impromptu lunch breaks that somehow led her to him, stolen hours when she knew Michael wouldn't be home. She convinced herself it was harmless, that she was just filling the emptiness her marriage had left behind. She knew it couldn't last, but she didn't want to stop. Jane leaned against Alex, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on his skin as the dim glow of the city lights filtered through the window. The world outside didn't exist in this moment. The excuses had come so easily. Another late night at work, an endless list of tasks that needed her attention. Michael hadn't questioned it. He never did. Alex kissed her shoulder, his breath warm against her skin. "You sure he won't suspect anything?" he murmured. Jane smirked, tilting her head back. "He never does." Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, ignored. Another message. Another call. She knew it was Michael, but right now she didn't care. She was lost in something else, something intoxicating, something that made her feel wanted again. Alex ran his hands down her back, pulling her closer. She closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the moment, into the heat of his touch, into the thrill of secrecy. The sound of the front door clicking open shattered everything. Jane's body stiffened, her heart stopping mid-beat. Alex froze too, his eyes widening as they both processed the reality that was crashing down around them. Footsteps. Heavy. Purposeful. Michael's voice echoed from the hallway. "Jane?" Her stomach dropped. She scrambled upright, her mind racing, but it was too late. The bedroom door swung open, and there he stood. Michael's face twisted, disbelief flashing into something darker. His eyes flicked between them, Jane tangled in the sheets, Alex frozen beside her. The silence was suffocating. Jane opened her mouth, but no words came. There was no excuse, no explanation that could undo what he had just seen. Michael's hands clenched at his sides, his breathing sharp and uneven. "You said you were working late." His voice was eerily calm, but his eyes burned with something unrecognizable. Alex shifted, his muscles tensing as if preparing for a fight. "Michael, listen." "Shut up," Michael snapped, his voice breaking. Jane reached for the blanket, pulling it over herself as if it could shield her from the wreckage of what she had done. The weight of her betrayal settled between them, suffocating, inescapable. Michael exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to rid himself of the image before him. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The front door slammed behind him. And just like that, everything was ruined. Michael stood in the doorway, his face pale with shock, his fists clenched at his sides. His eyes darted between Jane and Alex, taking in the sheets twisted around her, the unmistakable intimacy of the scene before him. His chest rose and fell with sharp, uneven breaths, his mind trying to process what his eyes had already confirmed. Jane pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her heart hammering in her chest. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He took a step forward, his expression twisting from disbelief to something darker. "You said you were working late." The words dripped with betrayal, his voice raw and unfamiliar. Alex sat up, running a hand through his hair, his posture tense. "Michael, listen." "Shut up." Michael's voice cut through the air like a blade. His gaze never left Jane. "How long?" His voice wavered, but the anger in his eyes remained steady. Jane swallowed hard, her throat dry. She couldn't lie. There was no excuse that could erase what he had just seen. "A few weeks," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to rid himself of the image in front of him. "A few weeks," he repeated, his voice hollow. "And you just... what? Come home? Kiss me? Pretend like everything's fine?" Tears burned at the back of Jane's eyes. "I didn't..." "You didn't mean for this to happen?" Michael snapped, his voice rising. "You didn't plan for me to find out?" He laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair. "God, I was so stupid." Alex shifted uncomfortably. "Michael, I'm sorry." Michael turned on him, his jaw clenched. "You don't get to say that. You don't get to apologize to me like this is some mistake you can undo." Jane reached for him, but he stepped back, shaking his head. "Don't," he warned, his voice low, dangerous. "Don't touch me." The weight of his words crushed her, stealing whatever breath she had left. Michael turned abruptly, heading for the door. "You want this life? You want him?" His voice broke slightly, but he recovered quickly, forcing his anger to hold him together. "Then have him." The front door slammed behind him, the echo ringing in Jane's ears. She stared at the empty space where he had stood, knowing nothing would ever be the same again. Jane sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank screen of her phone. No missed calls, no messages, just silence. She had tried calling Michael twice, her voice shaking as she left voicemails that she knew he wouldn't listen to. The house felt emptier than ever, the walls closing in around her. She had imagined this moment before, what it would be like if Michael ever found out. But she had never expected the sheer weight of regret pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The thrill, the secrecy, the rush she had once felt with Alex. All of it had evaporated, leaving behind only a hollow ache. Alex stood near the doorway, dressed now, but still looking like he didn't quite know where to go. His usual confidence was gone, replaced with something closer to guilt. "Jane?" His voice was soft, hesitant. She didn't look up. "Don't," she whispered. Alex exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I should go." She finally turned to face him, searching for something, reassurance, an explanation, maybe even an excuse to pretend that this had all been worth it. But his expression told her everything she already knew. "You don't have to," she said, but the words felt weak. "I do." His tone was firm. "Michael, your life. I don't want to be the reason it all falls apart." Jane let out a bitter laugh. "It already has." Alex hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but he didn't. Instead, he grabbed his bag and headed for the door. He paused one last time, glancing at her over his shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Jane." And then he was gone. She didn't try to stop him. The front door shut with a finality that sent a deep ache through her chest. She lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember how things had gotten this far. Had it really been worth it? The excitement, the escape, the way Alex had made her feel for a brief moment. Was any of it enough to justify what she had lost? Michael was gone. Alex was gone. And she was alone. The silence stretched around her, heavier than she had ever felt before.